Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle bedtime story. Tonight, we journey to the village of Thistlebrook, where whispers of an enchanting legend linger in the air. As you settle in, let your mind drift to the tale of Lyra, who ventures into the mysterious midnight garden, seeking hope and the secrets of an ancient witch. Feel the day's weight lift away and allow yourself to be embraced by the magic of her journey. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the story guide you into a peaceful sleep. The village of Thistlebrook had always been a quiet place, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the world, where the days seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the nights whispered secrets no one dared repeat. There was something about the air there, thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, that made it feel as though time itself moved slower. Yet beneath its peaceful exterior, the village was haunted not by ghosts, but by a story that had been passed down from one generation to the next. It was the story of the Midnight Garden. Everyone in Thistlebrook knew of the garden. They had all heard the tales, the warnings that echoed in the elders' voices as they sat around the hearth on cold nights. It was said that deep within the forest, past the twisted trees and beneath the shadow of the moon, lay a place where no sunlight ever touched. This was the Midnight Garden, a place of unimaginable beauty, where flowers bloomed only at the stroke of midnight, their petals gleaming like stars fallen to the earth. But the beauty of the garden was not what made it so feared. It was the witch who guarded it, the ancient witch whose power had long since become legend. The witch was said to be as old as the forest itself, her magic woven into every root and branch. She alone knew the secret to eternal life, and she kept it hidden within the blooms of her midnight flowers. Many had sought the garden, lured by the promise of immortality, but none had returned. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving nothing behind but whispers in the wind and the chilling howls of the beasts that roamed its depths. The elders spoke of those beasts as if they were nightmares made flesh, wolves with eyes that glowed like embers, owls whose wings stirred the air like a deathly wind, and serpents that moved like shadows through the underbrush. Each one was bound to the witch, cursed to guard the flowers with their lives, and it was said that to even look upon them was to invite doom. But still, the legend persisted. There were always those who thought they could outwit the witch, who believed they could slip past her enchanted beasts and pluck the immortal blooms from her garden. And there were always those who never returned. Lyra had grown up with these stories, the same as everyone else in Thistlebrook. She had heard them whispered in the dark, seen the fear in her neighbors' eyes whenever the forest was mentioned. But for Lyra, the stories had always felt distant, like something out of a dream. Until now, her father had fallen ill. It had started with a cough, a small thing that seemed harmless at first. But over time, It had grown worse, and now he lay in bed, pale and weak, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The village healer had done all she could, but Lyra knew in her heart that it wasn't enough. Her father was slipping away, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Nothing, except perhaps the midnight garden. The thought had come to her in the still hours of the night, when the world was quiet, and the weight of her father's illness pressed heavy on her chest. If the stories were true, if the witch's flowers really did hold the secret to immortality, then maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. But it was a fool's hope. Lyra knew that. Everyone who had ever sought the midnight garden had been lost, their names forgotten, their fates sealed by the forest's shadows. And yet, as she sat by her father's bedside, watching the rise and fall of his laboured breathing, she knew she had no choice. She could not stand by and do nothing. She could not let him die. The decision was made in a heartbeat, as quick and inevitable as the setting of the sun. Lyra would find the midnight garden. She would enter the forest and seek out the witch's flowers, no matter the cost. The villagers would call her mad. They would warn her, as they had warned so many others before her, that the forest was a place of death, that the witch's garden was not meant for mortal hands. But Lyra was not afraid of the stories. She was afraid of losing her father, and that fear was stronger than any legend. So, as the full moon began to rise over Thistlebrook, casting its silver light over the darkened forest, Lyra gathered her courage. With nothing but her father's locket clasped tightly in her hand, she set out into the night, her heart pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. The midnight garden awaited, and Lyra, for the first time, would discover the truth behind the legend. The moon hung high in the sky, a pale and distant eye that watched over the forest with cold indifference. Lyra had never ventured this deep into the woods before, and every step she took felt as though she was crossing a threshold into another world. A world where the trees whispered secrets in a language she couldn't understand, and the shadows seemed to shift and stir with a life of their own. The path ahead was little more than a narrow ribbon of earth, winding through the trees like a serpent, leading her deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. The air was heavy here, thick with the scent of moss and damp leaves, and the silence was unnerving. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to have forgotten this place. Lyra clutched her father's locket tightly in her hand, the cool metal a small comfort against the growing dread that coiled in her chest. The stories of the midnight garden had always seemed distant, almost unreal. But now, with every step she took, they felt too real. She could almost hear the voices of those who had come before her, their warnings echoing in her mind. Turn back before it's too late. No one ever returns. But she couldn't turn back. Not now. The forest grew darker as she pressed on, the trees closing in around her like sentinels guarding some ancient, forbidden secret. Branches twisted overhead, blotting out the sky, and the moonlight that had once guided her steps now struggled to break through the tangled canopy. She could barely see the path anymore, but something pulled her forward. An invisible thread winding through the darkness, leading her toward her goal. Time lost all meaning in the depths of the forest. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was the other way around. Lyra's legs ached from the effort of walking, and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. But she kept moving, her determination burning brighter than the fear that gnawed at her. Somewhere up ahead, she knew, was the garden. The place where the witch's flowers bloomed only at midnight, their petals gleaming with the promise of immortality. But the stories had warned of more than just the garden. They had spoken of the beasts. Lyra tried not to think about them as she walked, but the thought lingered at the edges of her mind. A dark presence she couldn't shake. The beasts were the witch's guardians, creatures bound by magic to protect the garden from intruders. No one knew what they truly were, only that they were dangerous, unnatural. Wolves with eyes like fire, some said. Others spoke of creatures far worse, beings not of this world, drawn from the deepest recesses of the night. She didn't know what to believe, but she would find out soon enough. The forest began to change as she drew closer to her destination. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the very breath of the night itself had settled here. The trees, which had once been towering and thick, now thinned out, their gnarled branches reaching upward like skeletal hands. And then, at last, Lyra saw it. The gate. It was made of iron, tall and twisted, covered in vines so thick they seemed to be part of the metal itself. Beyond it, the midnight garden lay, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. Even from a distance, Lyra could see the flowers, their petals shimmering faintly in the silver light, like jewels scattered across the ground. The sight of them took her breath away. But as she stepped closer to the gate, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the stillness. Lyra froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, deeper this time, vibrating through the air like the growl of some immense creature. Slowly she turned, her eyes scanning the shadows beyond the gate. There, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, something moved. A shape, large and dark, emerged from the gloom, its eyes gleaming like twin embers in the night. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf Lyra had ever seen. Its fur was as black as the void between the stars, and its eyes, those terrible burning eyes, seemed to pierce through her, seeing straight into her soul. The beast stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat. This was one of the witch's enchanted beasts. She knew it without question. Its very presence was charged with magic, an ancient and terrible force that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. For a long moment, the wolf simply stood there, watching her, as if weighing her worth. Lyra didn't move. She didn't dare. She could feel the weight of the locket in her hand, its cool surface grounding her, giving her strength. Then, without warning, the wolf turned and disappeared back into the shadows, as silently as it had come. Lyra stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. But the gate remained open, inviting her in. The way forward was clear. The midnight garden lay just beyond, but the wolves were watching, and she knew the real danger had only just begun. The gate groaned as Lyra pushed it open, its iron hinges creaking like ancient bones disturbed from their rest. The midnight garden lay before her, silent and shimmering under the moon's cold gaze. The air was different here, dense with magic, almost alive. The flowers, scattered like stars across the dark earth, seemed to pulse with a quiet, secret energy. Each bloom was impossibly delicate, the petals translucent and glowing faintly, as if they were touched by starlight. But the silence was deceptive. Lyra could feel it, a watchful presence that pressed against her skin, invisible but undeniable. The enchanted beasts of the witch's garden were here, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. She stepped carefully onto the mossy ground, the soft earth giving slightly beneath her boots. The garden felt endless, stretching out in all directions, with no clear path to guide her. The flowers, so close now, seemed to beckon, their fragile beauty promising the answer she had come for. Lyra's heart quickened as she imagined it. One single bloom, and her father would live. But the stories of the Midnight Garden had not been about hope alone. They had been about danger, and as she moved deeper into the garden, she understood why. Out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement. She turned her head sharply, but saw nothing. Only the quivering of the flowers, as if some unseen wind had passed through them. Then came another sound, soft at first, like the shifting of leaves or the faint rustle of wings. The air was thick with enchantment. She knew she was not alone. As if answering her thoughts, a shadow passed overhead, swift and silent. Lyra's gaze shot upward. Against the black canvas of the sky, she glimpsed a great owl, its wings spread wide, drifting soundlessly above the garden. Its eyes, enormous and shining with a strange light, locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to still. The owl was not like the creatures she had known in the village. It was otherworldly, its feathers tinged with silver and black, and its gaze held a cold intelligence. A warning, perhaps. The owl circled once, then vanished into the treetops, leaving her heart pounding. But it was not alone. A new sound reached her ears, a low hiss, deep and menacing. She spun toward the source, her breath catching in her throat. There, coiled among the twisted roots of an ancient tree, was a serpent. Its scales gleamed in the moonlight, an iridescent sheen of dark green and black, and its eyes, two gleaming orbs of liquid gold, seemed to follow her every movement. The serpent's body was impossibly long, winding through the underbrush like a living shadow, its tongue flicking in and out as though tasting the air, tasting her. For a moment, Lyra couldn't move. The serpent's eyes were hypnotic, pulling her in with a dangerous allure. It moved closer, its sinuous body sliding across the ground with a slow, deliberate grace. She felt a chill crawl down her spine. She had been warned of these creatures, told they were the witch's loyal guardians. To cross them was to invite death. But Lyra did not retreat. She could not. She had come too far. She took a slow, steady breath and stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The serpent raised its head, its golden eyes narrowing, as if considering her. For a moment, she thought it would strike, but then it lowered itself back into the grass, slithering silently away into the depths of the garden. The silence returned, heavier than before. Lyra exhaled a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. The beasts had not attacked, but their presence was a reminder. She was trespassing in a place she did not belong. The witch's magic was all around her, woven into the very air she breathed. The garden itself was alive with it, watching her, testing her. She could feel it in the way the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, in the way the flowers swayed as though responding to her presence. The wolf had let her pass, the owl had watched her, the serpent had spared her. But Lyra knew better than to think herself safe. This was only the beginning of the test. The garden had its own rules, and the beasts were part of that game. They were not ordinary creatures. They were manifestations of the witch's power, each one bound to the magic of this place. To survive, she would have to understand their purpose, and more importantly, why they had allowed her to continue. As she moved deeper into the garden, Lyra could feel the weight of their gazes, hidden but ever present. She was being watched from every shadow, every rustle of the leaves, every flicker of moonlight on the flowers. The creatures were always near, testing her resolve, waiting for a moment of weakness. The air thickened with enchantment, and yet, as she neared the center of the midnight garden, a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. The flowers seemed to glow brighter here, their light steady and true, as though she was drawing closer to something of great importance. The garden pulsed with magic, and Lyra knew that whatever secret it held was near, just beyond the reach of her fingers. But the beasts were not done with her yet. The real test had not yet begun. At the heart of the midnight garden, Lyra found herself surrounded by an eerie stillness. The moon above bathed the blooms in pale light, their petals shimmering like silver under its watchful eye. The flowers were unlike anything she had ever seen, each one delicate, as though spun from moonlight itself, yet pulsing with an undeniable power. She could feel the magic humming in the air, a soft rhythmic beat that seemed to match her own heartbeat. It was as though the garden breathed with her, its life intertwined with hers, if only for this moment. For a brief instant, Lyra forgot the danger. She was captivated by the beauty before her, the impossible elegance of the blooms swaying gently in the midnight breeze. Each flower seemed to glow from within, as though they held the secrets of the stars in their fragile petals. She could hardly believe she was here, standing in the very place that had haunted the stories of her childhood. But that beauty, she knew, was only a veil that concealed something far darker. Her gaze fell upon one particular bloom, larger and more brilliant than the others. Its petals were a pale violet, tinged with silver at the edges, and it seemed to call to her, drawing her in with its quiet, unspoken promise. This was what she had come for, the key to her father's salvation. One flower, and she could save him. One flower, and he would be granted life beyond the grip of death. But as her hand reached out to pluck it, a voice broke the silence. "Do you know what it is you seek?" The voice was soft, yet filled the air like a cold wind, sending a shiver through Lyra's bones. She froze, her hand hovering above the bloom, and slowly turned. From the shadows, the witch emerged. She was both more and less than what Lyra had imagined. Cloaked in darkness, her form seemed to shift, as though she were part of the garden itself, woven from its shadows and moonlight. Her eyes, black as the void between the stars, bore into Lyra, holding her in place with their ancient, terrible wisdom. The witch's beauty was undeniable, but it was the kind of beauty that inspired fear, a beauty that felt wrong, as if she had stepped outside the bounds of nature itself. "I asked you a question," the witch continued, her voice no louder than before. But now it carried a weight that seemed to press down on Lyra's chest. "Do you understand what it is you seek?" Lyra's voice faltered. She swallowed hard and tried again, her words coming out in a rush. "I seek one of your flowers, for my father. He's dying, and—" Yes," the witch interrupted, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "They always come for the ones they love." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. There was something unsettling about the way the witch spoke, as though she had seen this scene unfold 1,000 times before. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, her presence filling the space around them like a storm cloud. "You think the flower will save him?" the witch said, her eyes never leaving Lyra's face. "You think it will grant him life, spare him from death's grasp?" Lyra nodded, though the words now felt hollow in her mouth. The witch's gaze was so piercing, so knowing, that she could hardly hold it. "But tell me, child," the witch continued, her voice like silk, wrapping around Lyra's thoughts. "Do you know the price of such a gift?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a blade. Lyra felt the weight of it pressing down on her. And suddenly the garden seemed darker, the flowers less brilliant, their glow casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. "The price," Lyra echoed, her voice barely a whisper. The witch nodded slowly, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Every gift comes with a cost. The blooms of my garden do not offer life freely. For every life they grant, something must be taken in return." Lyra's pulse quickened. "What must be taken?" The witch smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of her lips. "A life for a life, a soul for a soul." Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her, as though the very earth was pulling her into its depths. The meaning of the witch's words began to sink in, cold and terrible. If she took the flower, if she used its power to save her father, something else would be demanded in return. Her father's life might be spared, but at what cost? The witch seemed to sense Lyra's hesitation, and her smile widened, though it did not reach her eyes. "Do you still wish to take the flower, knowing this?" Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend the choice before her. She had come so far, risked so much, but now, standing on the threshold of immortality, she realized the truth. The Midnight Garden did not offer salvation. It offered a terrible bargain, one that could not be undone. The witch's voice was softer now, almost tender. "Do not think you are the first to stand where you are now, faced with this choice. Many have come before you, and many will come after. They all believe the same thing, that they can outwit the price. But the garden is not so easily fooled." Lyra stood there, torn between the love she had for her father and the growing horror of what the garden demanded. The flower gleamed in the moonlight, so close, so impossibly beautiful. But now, all she could see was the cost it carried, like a shadow clinging to its petals. In the stillness, she realized that the price of immortality was far greater than she had ever imagined. Lyra stood frozen in the heart of the Midnight Garden, her breath shallow and uneven, the witch's words still echoing in her mind. A life for a life, a soul for a soul. The air seemed to press down on her from all sides, as if the garden itself was listening, waiting for her to make a choice. The flower that had once glimmered with such promise now seemed darker, its beauty shadowed by the weight of what it truly represented. The witch circled her slowly, her movements graceful and fluid, like a serpent coiling around its prey. Her black eyes, deeper than the night sky, never left Lyra's face. "You hesitate," the witch murmured, her voice soft and almost tender, as though she could taste Lyra's fear. "Is your father's life not worth any price?" Lyra's heart ached at the mention of her father. She had left him in his bed, pale and weak, his breathing shallow, knowing that each moment might be his last. She had made this journey for him, driven by love and desperation. But now, with the truth laid bare before her, the decision she had thought so simple had become impossible. "What will you take from me?" Lyra's voice trembled as she spoke, barely louder than a whisper. The witch's smile returned, sharp and knowing. "It is not for me to decide, child. The garden has its own rules, its own balance. When you take the flower, it will choose what it demands in return. Sometimes it is a memory, a piece of your past. Sometimes it is something more." Her gaze darkened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "A part of your soul, perhaps, or the life of someone you love." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the witch's cryptic words. A part of her soul. A life for a life. She had known the journey would not be easy, but this was something far darker than she had ever imagined. She thought of her father's face, the lines of worry and exhaustion etched into his features, the frailty of his body as it slipped further from life's grasp. How could she turn back now? But the witch had said it plainly. The garden did not give without taking. The flowers of the midnight garden were not a gift. They were a bargain. And to pluck one was to enter into a pact with something far older and more powerful than she could understand. A cold wind swept through the garden, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faintest hint of decay. The flowers seemed to sway in unison, as if they too were waiting for her decision. Lyra's hand hovered once more over the violet bloom, its soft glow tempting her, calling to her. She could almost feel its power thrumming in the air, just out of reach. The witch watched her with silent intensity, her expression unreadable. "Choose wisely, child," she whispered, her voice so low it barely broke the stillness. "For once the flower is plucked, the price is paid." Lyra's hand trembled. She could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her, crushing her with its enormity. Was she willing to risk her soul, her memories? What if the garden demanded something worse, something she could never give back? The thought of losing her father tore at her heart. But there was a part of her, deep inside, that recoiled at the idea of this dark bargain. "What if I refuse?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I walk away?" The witch's eyes gleamed with something like amusement, but her smile was cold. "Then you will leave as you came, empty-handed, and your father will die." The finality of her words hung in the air, thick and unyielding. There would be no second chances. If she left the garden now, she would lose her father forever. But if she stayed, if she took the flower, there was no telling what the garden would claim in return. For a long moment, Lyra stood there, torn between the two halves of herself, the part that loved her father with every fibre of her being, and the part that feared what she would lose if she gave in to the garden's dark magic. The night stretched on, silent and watchful, as if the stars themselves were waiting for her answer. Finally, she took a step back. Her heart broke with the weight of her decision, but she knew, deep down, that she could not pay the garden's price. Not like this. The witch's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face. But she said nothing. She simply watched as Lyra turned and began to walk away. Her steps slow and heavy, each one harder than the last. As she passed through the iron gate, the cold air of the forest wrapped around her like a shroud, and the silence of the midnight garden faded into the night. The flowers behind her continued to bloom, untouched, their glow casting faint shadows on the dark earth. Lyra did not look back, and as she left the midnight garden, the weight of what she had lost and what she had chosen not to lose settled over her like a cloak. Her father's fate was sealed, but her soul remained her own. The witch's garden had not claimed her, but the cost of her journey would haunt her forever. For in the end, the greatest price was the one she could not pay.